Okay, in this video, we're going to start talking about belief, justification, truth, and knowledge, which are all central notions for epistemology, central properties that epistemology is discussed. So what is a belief? As I've said before, a belief is a kind of psychological state. Specifically, a belief is the psychological state of affirming a proposition, taking a proposition to be true. To call something a belief is not to disparage it. Sometimes people try to disparage belief by contrasting belief with fact in the way that White here in this conversation does. White is the one with the white shirt, Maroon is the one with the maroon shirt. I'll typically refer to the characters by their shirt color. So Maroon says the earth is warming, and White says that's a belief, not a fact. And what I want you to see is not that White is, White thinks this is false or something, and or not established, whatever. I think that's wrong, but that's not the point. The point here is this. Contrasting beliefs with facts, given the way we're using the term belief, is utter nonsense. A fact is a way the world is. A belief is a psychological state of affirming a proposition. So you can't say that's a belief, not a fact. You can say this, you believe that's a fact, I don't believe that's a fact. That's a fine thing to say. But that's not saying the thing here is not a belief. Of course it is. It's a belief this person has. Sorry, it's not a fact. Of course it is if it's true. If it's false, it's not. If it's true, it is. But whether this person believes it has nothing to do with whether or not it's a fact. So what White should say isn't that's a belief, not a fact, which is kind of a nonsensical contrast. What White should say, or at least it's not the intended contrast, what White should say is you believe that's a fact, but I don't. Okay. So again, this is nonsense. So Maroon says, well, what's the difference between a belief and a fact? And White says, a belief is just what you think is true, a fact what is true. And Maroon would then say, okay, so would you prefer I say, I believe it's a fact that the earth is warming? And Maroon correctly says, it would be silly to always preface whatever I say with, I believe it's a fact that. Why would we talk that way? It's just silly. Like I say, I believe it's a fact that there's people in the room right now, so I can start talking. It's ridiculous. I can just say, like, there's people here, so I'm going to start talking. So here's Maroon's point. My saying some proposition P, like the earth is warming or there's people in the room, implies that I believe it's a fact that P. That is, I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it, or at least socially you can expect I believe it if I say it. So White asks, how should I indicate that I think you're wrong? And Maroon says, do this. If I say the earth is warming and you disagree, you just say, you think I'm wrong, or my belief is false, or the earth isn't warming, something along those lines. You don't draw some bogus contrast between beliefs and facts. Beliefs, as I've said before, can be treated as categorical. So back here real quick. When I say to call something a belief is not to disparage it, what I mean is anytime you say like, oh, he believes that, all you're saying is he thinks that's true. If you say, they over there, they think that's false, all you're saying, they don't believe that. All you're saying is they don't think it's true. Okay, so to call something a belief is not to disparage it. Now, beliefs can be treated as categorical or continuous. That means they can be treated as all or none, like the difference between height and age. They're like two independent scales. It's a categorical difference. Or continuous as matters of degrees, like the difference between one height and another, or one age and another, a single scale, different places on the scale. So here we have someone who says, I believe the earth is warming. That's a categorical belief, a categorical expression. Over here, you have somebody who says, I strongly believe the earth is warming. Now that's continuous because the person is sort of modifying belief by indicating that it comes in degrees. Or you could say, like, I weakly believe it, or whatever. When people talk about strength of belief, they treat belief as continuous, as a matter of degree. As I've said before, those are called credences, your degree of belief. We mark the strength of belief by saying, for example, that we are more or less confident in a claim, more or less sure of a claim, and so on and so forth. We can call our degree of belief a credence, where a credence in P is measured on a scale from 0 to 1, with 0 being you are certain that P is false, you're certain that not P, 1 being you're certain that P is true, and 0.5 being total neutrality. Anything above 0.5 is starting to lean towards believing P. Anything below 0.5 is starting to lean away from believing P. Exactly how far along you have to get towards 0.1, that is like say 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, before you say you believe it without qualification, is, I think, unclear, contextual shifting. We can talk more about that later. But for now, what I care about is that you get the basic idea. Okay. Justification is a property of belief. Whenever you're learning about a new term, you should think, what is it a property of? So beliefs are properties of the mind or individuals. Justification is a property of beliefs. So a belief has this property, that is, has the property of being justified if and only if it's rationally held. So being rationally held is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for a belief being justified. Your justification for a belief is your reason for holding that belief. Where your reason is the kind of thing you'd say to convince someone else it's true, it's not the cause of your belief. If you remember back to our earlier discussion from an earlier video, we distinguished between causes of a belief and reasons for holding a belief. When we talk about justification, we're looking for reasons for holding a belief, evidence, warrant, the kind of thing that could convince somebody else, the kind of thing that indicates it's likely to be true, not for an explanation of why you hold the belief. A belief is rationally held and so justified when it's held for good reason, otherwise it's unjustified. Justification also can be treated as categorical or continuous. That is, you can say, my belief is justified. You can say, my belief is unjustified. That's a categorical distinction. Or you can say, my belief is pretty darn justified. Or my belief is kind of justified. That's a continuous distinction. Next up, truth and falsity. Truth and falsities are values of propositions. Roughly and controversially, I mentioned before, I'm adopting a simple-minded view of what truth and falsity are because I think it's the right view. For most of our purposes, you can substitute in whatever view you like, and the conversation will go on in just the same way. I just want to have this simple-minded view on the table because it's a good one, easy one to work with. So on this view, a proposition is true if and only if the world is as the proposition says it is, and the proposition is false otherwise. So if the world is the way the proposition says, it's true. If it isn't, it's false. This is sometimes called the correspondence theory of truth. The idea is that a proposition is true when it corresponds to the world. So the idea is a proposition represents the world as being a certain way, and when the world is the way the proposition represents it as being, then the proposition is true. And when the world isn't the way the proposition represents it as being, then the proposition is false. As I just mentioned this, so I don't need to leave it there. Truth and falsity is categorical. It is not a matter of degree. Now, there are a small minority of people who do think it is a matter of degree. They think some propositions are like 0.75 true and others are 0.25 true, where that isn't an epistemic notion. That doesn't have to do with our credence. That doesn't have to do with our confidence in the proposition. It has to do with the proposition itself. But that's a minority view, and we're not going to countenance it here. If you think it's right, that's okay. It can be, most of what we say can be adjusted to fit that view. Okay. I want to emphasize people sometimes talk as if truth and falsity is a matter of degree. They say, for example, there's no absolutes, or it's never black and white, or there are always shades of gray. But most often when they do this, what they mean is our belief is never absolute, or should never be absolute. Our justification is never absolute, is never 100%. It's always in between. That's what shades of gray mean. Our credence is somewhere between 0 and 1. They're not saying the world itself is somewhere between 0 and 1, as if, it's 0.7 true that there are more than 3 people in the room I'm in right now. No, either there's more than 3 people or there aren't more than 3 people. The claim there's more than 3 people is either true or it's false, but your confidence in it can come in degrees. Okay. What about knowledge? Well, knowledge is a state constituted by mind and world. You can think of it as a relation between mind and world, where someone, X just stands for a random person, an arbitrary person. X knows that some proposition P is true only if X believes P is true, P is in fact true, and X's belief that P is justified. Now notice those are only providing necessary conditions, because I said if X believes P is true and X's belief that P is true, then X knows. So, I didn't say if X believes P is true and X's belief is justified, then X knows. I said rather, only if those conditions are met does X know. So these conditions here are necessary for knowledge, but not sufficient. And we'll talk about why that is. We'll also talk about why it is anybody would think these are necessary conditions. But I'm going to leave that aside and stop this video here, and we'll continue next time.